Professor in Writing and Society Research at the Centre at Western Sydney University. Sorry, the Writing and Society Research Centre at Western Sydney University. Jane has a diverse track record as a writer and commentator on history and politics of cultural change, and she writes regularly for Inside Story. So Jane, I'm just going to share Jane's slides now and pass across to Jane to present.
Thank you, Monique. I'm speaking from Ngunnawal land, and I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners, past, present, and emerging, whose values and traditions going back many, many centuries may well provide us with the best way forward at this critical juncture, really, in our life as a species. One of the commonest objections to basic income is that it will discourage people from working, or that it is some kind of alternative to work. So that people argue it runs counter to basic human needs to do meaningful work. I'd not only like to refute or address that, I'd like to turn it on its head by arguing that the change in work is actually the strongest argument for basic income, and that we are at a time when the future of our economy depends on a completely changed view of what employment is and what it's for. We hear all the time this slogan, jobs and growth, jobs and growth, jobs and growth. I'm sure most people participating here would be skeptical about that. But what is our alternative model, and how are we really looking at the future of work if we don't agree with that slogan? So I'd like to begin with the first slide. Here we go. And if you just hold that in your mind, I'm sure that will not be hard. This is an 11-year-old. It's not her baby. She's carrying a sibling. And she's at work on one of the many vast trash heaps around the world, doing what would have been called scavenging in the past. That's an interesting word and another one to think about for a while. It always had this very kind of denigratory flavor to it as a word. If you were a scavenger, you were like some kind of pest species, raking over all sorts of stuff that should be left alone, trying to make a profit from it. She's collecting plastic and bottle tops that she can sell for really a minute amount of money to recycling companies, and that will just keep the family, help to keep the family in food. So the next slide. Now this is at the opposite end of the spectrum. This is some children at the Ars Electronica festival in Linz. And these are the children of the STEM generation. Science, technology, engineering, and medicine is supposed to be the optimum form of training for their future. It will turn them into prosperous, desirable employees who will be able to do dignified, important work and lead the economy forward. If we could go back to the first one. Again, I want to reverse the valuation on this. This is the future of work. You're looking at this. This is the future of work. Not only that, this should be the future of work. Not that the young workers of the future should have to work in these conditions in this way, but the work of the scavenger is actually the future of our coming generations at work, because we have created so much trash on this planet that the work of scavenging, of going through it, of sorting it, of returning it to some kind of environmental use, and of gaining our future, supplying our future needs for clothing, building, and so on from this trash. That is the work of future generations. So if we go to slide 2 again. If you are educated in STEM, you and your parents and others who have hopes for your future, your teachers, may imagine for you a future in systems design or chemical processing, perhaps communications, marketing. If we could go to the next slide. We need to ask questions about what work is being done and about who owns the work. That's a question I wish everyone would ask every time they hear jobs and growth. Who owns the work? These are workers in the garment industry, and we'll come back to them. Can we just see what the next slide is? I forget what order I put them in. These are in Leicester, in the UK, where their work is supposed to be governed by certain minimum requirements of employment. There's a minimum wage, there's a maximum number of hours, and so on. But this is an industry that's constantly getting around it. And even in the UK, Leicester garment workers are being paid as little as £3 an hour, which is between $5 and $6. They're being required to work shifts from 8 in the morning till 6 at night with absolutely minimal breaks or none at all. They're on 0 hours contracts. So in the event that there's a cancellation of an order to this company, they're simply laid off at no notice with no rights. The work they are doing, if we go to the next one, is producing not just clothing, but also trash. This is the biggest byproduct of their industry. It's a very high volume industry. Overproduction is absolutely massive. And on a daily basis, that very factory would be producing as a byproduct cartloads of this kind of trash. This is fabric scraps. It may also be unsold garments, which are stored in warehouses, stocked from floor to ceiling, vast Amazon scale warehouses full of unsold clothing because of the overproduction. We have the next one. This is an example of unused clothing or recently used clothing. As you can see, it's been compacted to make almost walls in this warehouse. Each one of those walls of compacted garments is tens of thousands of stuff that you and I might wear on a daily basis. The whole aim of the industry is to increase sales by driving the price down, so people can afford to buy more than they need and throw it away. So it's a massive throwaway industry. So if you like, if you go back in your mind to the picture of the children at Linz studying robotics, perhaps they will become systems designers, chemical engineers, perhaps they will work in communications and marketing. Perhaps in doing so, they will be responsible precisely for what you're looking at now. Because systems designers have created this. Computer programmers have created this. Chemical engineers have produced the fabrics that have created this. People who work in marketing and promotion have enabled this by creating the retail industry that keeps it going. And it's all going the way of the 11-year-old in Kenya who lands up going through it on a trash heap, trying to make a few cents. She's actually the only one in that chain of workers who is pushing it back in the direction of the planet. which ultimately is our employer and our only resource, which is why I'm calling her the worker of the future, who is actually showing the way to the people at Lindt who think they are leading it. Can we have the next slide? These are also workers who are part of a chain of work led by systems designers, machine designers, STEM specialists who will devise the materials in which the food is packaged, and hygienists who will design, you know, the gear they're wearing to ensure that no contamination gets in here to interfere with the insurance systems that the food industry is governed by and the food standards it's governed by. So again, you see how this chain happens between the high end, the STEM trained workers who are leading the system, and people in the middle here who are simply job workers, and their conditions are constantly being driven down. The volume is constantly being driven up. If we could go to the next one. And packaging becomes part of the process of retail and promotion of food. It can contribute to the waste of food itself, but of course packaging produces massive amounts of waste. In the picture you're looking at, none of that packaging has any value whatsoever. It's not, if you're looking at an economy, it has no contribution to an economy other than a negative one of contributing to the trash mountains. It doesn't help the food. Food will rot quicker if it's under plastic. And you've all seen those cucumbers sleeved in plastic. This image was actually taken from a website which is promoting packaging and its advantages to retailers. It enhances the color of food, they're told. It makes it more hygienic if customers are picking over it. It enables portion and packaging control. So from a retailer's point of view, they quite like this packaging. Go to the next one. Here's one of the consequences of that kind of packaging. These are known as the trash islands. They're off the coast of Central America. They're more than islands, they're continents now. And this is why I'm not exaggerating when I say that the Kenyan 11-year-old is doing the work of the future, and the work of the future is scavenging. That does not mean our young people should be working in the conditions that she's working in. The work of scavenging will involve all the STEM skills you can throw at it. It will involve systems design, chemical engineering, communications, promotion. It will involve physicists, marine scientists, environmentalists of all kinds. Every human skill will be involved in the economy of scavenging. And it is ultimately the economy of the planet. So I'll finish up now with a return to the basic income scheme. Shall I put myself back on? No, it doesn't work that way. How is basic income relevant? It's relevant because without it, workers like the garment workers you saw and the workers on the production line in the packaging factory have no option but to take that work. They're in an economy that requires them to do that kind of work. They've somehow fallen to the bottom end of the system, and that's what's available to them. So they're doing the work of producing the trash because they have no choice. If we introduce a basic income, we introduce a basic choice of work. Essential work still needs to be done. It has to be done. That's the work of caring for each other, healthcare, emergency work, the work of caring for children, and fundamentally the work of caring for the planet. So basic income does not absolve you from work. what it does is restore to you and your community and your society the prerogative of deciding what work should be done and why it should be done. I think it's very helpful to see basic income not as an advantage for an individual, although it can be a life-saving advantage. If you imagine that Kenyan 11-year-old being given a basic income, her and her infant sibling would have transformed prospects. They might even be able to go back to school and study STEM subjects. But if you look at it as an aggregate, and it's the whole of her family, the whole of her village and community. And if you go to Leicester and the workers in the garmentry industry, it's their families, it's the people who live in their street and their neighborhood who perhaps have fallen into a place where the economy isn't working very well, there are very few jobs available, and they have to take the least worst option, which is often close to the worst option. So basic income provides a kind of water table, it provides a support underneath the working economy that restores to us the responsibility for our fundamental economy, which is the planetary economy. That's really all I felt I needed to say. I'm a little bit under time, but I'm happy with that. I was promised Loliana, I'll give her my extra minutes because she makes very good use of them. And happy to answer questions later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jane. And thank you for what I think is quite a provocative sort of view of how we look at work and how value is created, and the importance of bringing back choice to the type of work that people might do. I did have one question for you, because I know we talked a little bit on our calls around this idea of whether having a basic income might be a disincentive to work. And I was interested just to hear your thoughts briefly on that.
I mean, that is the biggest question. One answer often given is that people want to work, and they do. Humans have always worked. If you really don't want to work, for whatever reason, they're probably not that big a proportion of the population in that category. And those who really don't want to work, there may be a reason for it. You know, there may be mental health reasons, or other kind of circumstantial reasons, or people may be saying they don't want to work when actually they have given themselves some work to do that they regard as very urgent. They may have a project they're doing, you know, they may be doing an artistic work or writing something or studying something. So the question of what work is needs to be part of that argument. But really, I think what I've said is my real answer, that there is absolutely urgent work to do everywhere. Most people will do urgent work and not even think of it as work. If your neighbour's house is threatened by a bushfire and you're rushing in there to help them get the dog in the car, the kids in the car, a few essential things, hose down the house, are you going to call that work? If at one remove further down, you think there might be a bushfire and things need to be cleared from around your area, will you think that's work and I don't really want to do it because I don't really want to do work? So the very use of the term work, and particularly the term employment, the translation of the word work to the word employment, means that it is in somebody's gift or right to allocate. They have the prerogative to allocate this. So they not only decide who they're going to employ and on what terms, they also decide what work they're going to get done. And that's the crux really of the argument I'm running. We have to change that.
Thank you, Jane. Yeah, I'm very interested in the idea you've introduced around local communities as well, having an opportunity to decide what is the priority of work for their areas. And I think we'll probably come back to that later. So thank you so much, Jane. Can we give Jane a round of virtual applause? Now, I did, I'm afraid, forget to mention at the beginning that we are recording this session. So if you don't want to be on camera, please feel free to keep your camera off. And also, if you have any questions, please feel free to add them into the chat and we'll come back to as many of them as we can at the end. So next, I'd like to introduce our next speaker, so Loriana Lucioni. So Loriana is a PhD student at the University of Queensland. She's close to completing her dissertation on the cultural feasibility for the implementation of universal basic income in Australia, which she's been working on for 5 years, I believe, is it? Okay, a long time anyway.
Yeah.
So Loriana also has completed degrees in psychology, sociology, and a master's in European and comparative social policy at LSE. And she's been involved with UBI activism and advocacy in Australia since 2017. So over to you, Loriana. Looking forward to hearing about your research work.
Thank you very much, Monique. Thank you for everyone here today in this webinar, for listening to us and for listening to us people. You know, we're talking about an idea that has been considered utopian for centuries. And I would like to start by acknowledging the Turrbal people, the traditional custodians of the land on which I live and work, and a land that was never ceded. And I pay my respect to the elders past, present, and emerging, whose wisdom and knowledge is needed today as ever. And I would also like to thank Jane for the thought-provoking presentation and the clarity in which she conveyed these messages and images, which are obviously one of the best ways of talking as stories and narratives. So thank you for the invitation to talk today. It is a great pleasure for me to talk about universal basic income, not least because I spent the past 3.5 years researching it. And I'm very fortunate to have this platform to start and share in a very short form my research results and the idea that I had behind this research. So it will be more, I do not have a formal presentation. I will try and tell it more as a story, and I might run the risk to go over time. So please, yeah, if you can just give me heads up, and I'll try and stick to it and wrap it up. So a short introduction of universal basic income, it's needed, I think. So it's very easy to think about is that the acronym, so the U for universal and unconditional, basic, which people have interpreted in different ways. So in the formal definition given by Bien, there is no amount for this basic. So what we mean by basic is really to be decided at a context level, at national context level. The amount that I've assumed in my research and that most financing model take, it's an amount that covers for your basic needs. So the basic basket of essential goods. And it is an income, and this is also another part that needs to be highlighted. So it is paid in cash. It's not paid in the form of goods and services like concurrent ideas that have been put forward, like the universal basic services idea, mainly promoted in the UK. And it is an income and not goods and services because it takes away this paternalism from the state that someone decides. So, okay, this is what you need as a house, this is what you need as food, etc. You're given money. So there is a recognition of a critical autonomy and trust in the individual. I give you money and I will not judge how you spend your money, but we can talk about this and the implication of this later. A lot of people think once you give this initial introduction, it's okay, it's money for nothing. Let's work through this concept of money for nothing and how I became interested in UBI. I remember studying it, universal basic income, during my master degree years ago as one of the social policy options, but it wasn't much talked about back in 2012. And at the time, I wasn't at all convinced because I was so stuck into loving the sociology of work that I really couldn't see it as a necessity. And in fact, I thought, well, it must lead to some kind of increase in individualization and a stripping away of the dignity that we acquire through work, the sense of identity, the so-called occupational identity that we acquire through paid employment rather than work. And I work with unions, labor rights. I was very close to the feminist issues of the male breadwinner model and the oppression resulting in the household. And I was all of that because at the time I couldn't really understand the revolutionary seed that a UBI can plant. And the revolutionary seed that we need right now to regenerate society. But how does that leap happen in my thinking? Well, firstly, we need to understand why universal basic income is revolutionary and not reformist. And to clarify, I do refer to universal basic income, talking about it as the progressive model of universal basic income, which is not to be confused with a conservative model that is actually supported by very few people, but is too often portrayed as the UBI that everyone talks about. A progressive universal basic income model like the Ingalls, Phillips and Stewart by the Australian National University model that I've worked with in my research is one that works in unison. It works with a strengthened public and free health system, education system, and additional social services. So how was I persuaded by universal basic income? Well, I came across UBI in conjunction with another book I was reading, and it's called The Refusal to Work, which I highly recommend to everyone, by David Frame. And that linked back, it got me really interested in reading all the post-capitalist literature from Goretz until Smirchek and Williams more recently. And I started to think again about universal basic income and the hidden potential. So what are these hidden potential of a universal basic income? So it links a duty to work from a right to income. And by doing this, it is actually redefining what we mean by being human. What is the value that we attach to human life? And how does it do it? Well, basically, with a universal basic income, what we are asserting is that we are not simply valuable because we produce and consume. So it reignites an understanding that life might have intrinsic value. And by living in a society where we are practically cut out from options of supporting a livelihood in dignity without entering the formal labor market, it has the potential to truly free people to decide on the life and activities they want to pursue to flourish. And we can decide how and when. We can decide how because the payment is universally equal, which implies that whether you are a banker or a gardener or a stay-at-home mother, you are equally recognized and your contribution is equally recognized. Your value, the value of your life is equally recognized by society in your unique way of contribution. It removes the stress of survival and the shorter attention span that it causes, together with so many other stress-related issues that affect our so-called developed society, from addictions to homelessness to suicide, etc. And a freed mind has more capacity and time to think, to innovate, to participate, to collaborate, to critique. Its universal character means that we can remove so many categories, man-made categories of division, such as the deserving, the undeserving, the leaners or the lifters, recipients or contributors. We all contribute and we all receive in different ways and at different stages of our life. And the moral authoritarian attitude that pushes us towards judging and condemning how people spend their money together with a more paternalistic attitude, so busy macro-managing people's life, are replaced by a recognition of critical and interdependent autonomy of humans, and so on. So going back to my research, I thought, wow, this is the policy we need as the first step to a paradigmatic change. And I want to be clear that universal basic income is a first step, it's not the final goal. Because we have to liberate people materially and psychologically first for them to become the empowered people that society needs for radical change. So I started an investigation on language and discourse, because once you understand how all this that I'm saying is culturally and psychosociologically deep, so how deep is the change, the cultural change required, not only to implement a universal basic income, but also to accompany all the other implementation and changes that are required to move towards a radically different society, then you understand that it is on values, on cognitive frames, and on big narratives that we have to work. And that's what I set out doing with my research. So it's a universal basic income culturally feasible in Australia. I run focus groups, 7 focus groups with ordinary citizens, because I wanted to try and locate in these discussions, in these deliberations, what are the things that force thought? What are the hot issues or topics, the points where values clash, where there is a need to reach a compromise about deep-seated values that are so hard to change? And the analysis, I ran a thematic analysis and critical discourse analysis of these deliberations, and I clustered them to understand, firstly, why do Australians desire a universal basic income? Secondly, why they do not desire it? And thirdly, how do they desire it? So the findings revealed not only that 6 out of the 7 focus groups deliberated on the desirability, so they do want a universal basic income in Australia. The findings also show that people are articulating values, frames, and narratives that come from what are broadly called post-capitalist discourses, in which I include a feminist, post-productivist, ecologist discourse, and many others. And people, so ordinary citizens, are already creating this bigger picture, and it's articulating around this core concept of a universal basic income. So why do people desire universal basic income? I had 6 main themes that people articulated. The first one is freedom, and the main frame of freedom was because it allows, universal basic income allows the freedom to choose how and when to contribute. And this is very important. So people don't see a universal basic income in a more negative understanding of freedom, the more individualistic, like I'm free to do whatever I want. The framing was very clear. The overarching frame was allow freedom to choose how and when to contribute. The second theme is psychological security. UBI confers psychological security essential to individual, societal, and ecological flourishing. The third theme was cost benefit. So people could clearly see that its economic benefits far outweigh its costs. The fourth one, social responsibility. UBI ensures reciprocity between individuals' moral duty to contribute and government's moral obligation to ensure fairness and sustainable use of the commons. And then the fourth theme, emancipation, and the sixth theme, labor markets. So, but what were the underlying frames? So all these people coming from so many different perspectives and walks of lives. There were 4 underlying frames which are essential because they are the ones that articulate all of these differing emancipatory discourses. The first one is self-worth is acquired through contribution, which goes back to what Jane was saying about work. What do we mean by work? How are we contributing? And that is the point, like people want to contribute. The second is human life as intrinsic value. The third is happiness is relational. So people do fully understand that in order to be happy, you need to be recognized. Like, you need recognition that whatever you're doing, it makes you feel happy. And, you know, if there is a societal recognition of that, then you are happy because you're recognized. And generosity precedes reciprocity. In other words, so universal basic income is acting like this discourse nodal point, in the sense that it is responding to these political demands from different constituencies. And from a discourse theoretical perspective, UBI is acting like the nodal point of what is understood theoretically as a counter-hegemonic discourse. It means that it's forming as a discourse that could actually struggle against the hegemony of neoliberalism and neoconservatism. The findings of the second chapter are equally important. The findings are about the only group that deliberated against the desirability of having a universal basic income in Australia. Because in here I was able to understand what are the frames that people put forward in arguing against, you know, and what are the underlying values. So in terms of framing, what I understood is that economic framings of a universal basic income that do not question the hegemonic construction of humans as primarily productive units, such as, for example, the automation framing that has been so predominant to universal basic income, which goes on the line that robots are coming, jobs are disappearing, therefore we need a universal basic income so that people can keep on living and consuming. Well, this kind of framing is highly ineffective because we are not reframing the core of what we mean, what we are. So they are weak, and in deliberations, they do not convince social conservatives or other people against the idea. Equally, arguments founded around concepts such as redistribution based on the spoils of a country are weak because they do not challenge categories such as deservingness and undeservingness. So the nobody is promised anything frame can only be countered by frames that assert that life has intrinsic value. Worldviews that construct humans as inherently lazy and selfish cannot be challenged unless there is a radical reframing. In other words, we cannot simply negate these worldviews. We need to offer alternatives. For example, selfishness is considered both an inescapable objective human trait, but is equally condemned by social conservatives who use, for example, concepts such as charity to obviate from this. But selfishness is equally not encouraged in a progressive framing of universal basic income, which relies on human capacity for altruism, compassion, and recognition of interdependency. So how can we establish a dialogue between this? By not negating human selfishness, but by arguing that human nature is also altruistic, that altruism enhances cooperation, and that cooperation relies on trustworthiness. I will not go in depth, but I have many other examples of framings which are very interesting. Another one that I might mention is related to this concept of charity. So when charity frames are used instead of rights-based frames, we need to excavate into the commonalities of these differing approaches to social policy and highlight these commonalities, because they are the frames that can actually link these groups of people. And these commonalities are: to give is the good thing to do, and human beings are interconnected. So not interrelated, but interconnected. And frames such vulnerability is universal and independent of context, is effective in that it avoids the process of othering, whereby we identify people as somehow faulty or different from us, and so on. And finally, in the third finding chapter, participants not only elaborated on the reasons why they want a universal basic income, but how do they want it. And it is a system where public health and education, social housing, and additional services are highly regarded in recognition of the value and significance of the common and public good, and in recognition of the fact that we need a whole supportive system to implement, not only to implement a universal basic income, but to accompany and educate society to flourish in the regenerative, compassionate, cooperative, caring, and innovative one that a universal basic income could allow for. And I think I'll just stop here for the moment, and I'm very happy to go into more depths about my research results if people are interested in that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Loriana. I think there's a lot of really fascinating ideas that have come out of your presentation in terms of sort of, again, around perception of what work is and the value of work, and also even, as you were saying, right back to what is our perception of human nature, if you like. I have one quick question for you. With your focus groups, were there a couple of things that stood out in terms of the main sort of concerns or barriers that people had about basic income?
There were usually, the usual ones. So would people stop working? But they were initial. They were just really initial, like in the break ice moment of the conversation. And it was like what I observed it was a very fascinating dynamic, because it was people coming from all different categories and age groups and background, and they could see. So what I've talked about, these underlying frames, these were things that everyone could agree on, like that after 2 hours of discussion, they could see, and they could see the value in it. And probably the most fascinating group was obviously the one that deliberated for the underserved ability to have a universal basic income. And in that, what we can learn as researchers, but as a society in general, is that firstly, we cannot and we should not aim at convincing everyone. That is the first point. But also that if we focus on the commonalities, so if we excavate and we see, well, actually, we do have common values in there. So what is motivating, our dissent? So it was, but yeah, it's the usual ones. It's about laziness, it's about selfishness, and it's about deservingness. These are the main recurring things that initially were, or should we have it or not?
Thank you so much, Loriana. And I think that gives us a great sort of foundation and segue into our next speaker, Josh McGee. So Josh is the founder and convener of Basic Income Australia. So the group's been running for about 4 years now and hosts monthly basic income discussions and action meetings. Josh is also studying a double degree in robotics engineering and computer science, and has an interest in using automation to meet people's needs. So thank you so much for joining us today, Josh. And hello. And Josh, did you want to add anything to that before we jump into our little Q&A?
I guess I'll just say, in terms of the group, the Basic Income Australia, it can be viewed as kind of like a partner group to the NENA Hub, because we're connected through me. I am the joining thread. Great,
thank you, Josh, and thank you for being that that connecting thread. So I can see there's some questions in the chat about people wanting to know some more sort of practical sort of information about trials, how much would you be paid for a basic income, that sort of thing. So I was wondering if you could give us a little bit of an overview of your understanding of any trials that might be happening and any sort of outcomes or sort of interim findings from them.
So there are new trials basically every week. Somebody messaged me last night saying that there's something happening in Wales. But the thing that I want people to think about when we're talking about trials is, what is the definition of a basic income? We're talking about something that's universal for every citizen or every permanent resident. We're talking about something that's up to a certain threshold of what we consider to be livability. And we want to make sure that it's unconditional in the sense that you can't lose it. If you cut back on any of those restrictions, then you could say that Centrelink is a basic income, although I don't think anybody here would, because it doesn't meet those conditions. And the problem with trials is that they always miss out on some of those conditions. So they will trial not an entirely livable wage for a small population. For a small population. And the problem is that people are going to react differently in a small population when compared with the full population. And so I would say, and not everybody agrees with me, so I'm not speaking for all of Basic Income Australia, but but you can't trial a basic income because of its scale. And the second thing I would say in terms of trials is that even if they were to go badly, I think we should still do it. If slavery were to be common and legal today, then if we were to trial it and it would go badly, we should still do it because people need that freedom. If people turned out to be lazy after a slavery abolition trial, that's okay. It's okay if people are lazy.
Thank you. So are there particular trials that you know of internationally that you could tell us a little bit about? I guess assuming that, you know, some people here on the call may have more sort of background and information in this subject than others. So perhaps, you know, from a bit of a beginner's perspective, could you give us a little bit of an overview of some of the trials that you're aware of?
So I just noticed somebody in the chat brought up Alaska. Alaska has Alaskan Permanent Fund where they distribute dividends from the oil to residents of Alaska. And that's, I think, about $1,000 or $2,000 a year, but it's not a livable rate. So therefore, I would consider that to be a partial basic income. There's also something that's been happening in Stockton that's getting a lot of media attention. The mayor, something Tubbs, he's been promoting it publicly a lot. But there are so many trials. We're so far beyond the point of needing trials from my perspective. And they often show very similar results, which is not, well, people who would leave work would be people who would want to leave work. So students and parents. But as I mentioned, I don't think trials are meaningful or important, which is not what people want to hear, but that's what I think. I'm speaking for myself.
Okay, I mean, I guess one of the things that struck me also from what we've discussed today is the element of care labour and the value of care labour that may be sort of more attributed perhaps within a new model. So in terms of, I guess, the possibility to look at what might work in the Australian context, what do you think might be required in terms of sort of preparing the ground or creating some sort of foundational change to make this sort of thing possible in Australia?
I think COVID has been a disastrous thing for the world, but the best thing that could possibly happen for the basic income movement. Because first of all, it's encouraged us to go online, and therefore we've got a new connected national network that we didn't have before when we were meeting in person. And secondly, we've seen that in the matter of days, we can implement something that is beyond what we would have considered to be the basic income threshold. Typically in Australia, we're talking about the Henderson poverty line. There's a few different poverty lines. The Henderson poverty line, I think, is about $450 a week. And Centrelink got boosted above that, and it happened almost overnight. So I think it's quite clear from that it's a political challenge, not a technical challenge.
It is
sorry. I just wanted to second Josh's view on the trials. It tends to be another of those first reactions. Well, how does it actually work if you give it a go? They can be extremely misleading. I mean, some of them are done simply with the aim of getting a selected range of individuals back into the workforce. Now, what kind of workforce are you getting them back into? Do you want them to go into the packaging industry? You know, that's one problem. And then they'll often declare, oh, it didn't work because they didn't get back in the workforce. Well, that's not the point, that you haven't trialed basic income at all, if that's your model. But the scale thing is very important. And another one, it was a European one, it might have been Norway, where quite isolated individuals were given this supplement. And then it was declared, well, they were all right, well, I had it, and then not all right afterwards. Well, what would you expect? It's really only testable at a community, on a community level. My thought during the bushfires was that was an ideal opportunity for trialing, because had you given it to the whole population of some of the worst affected towns, then you could have seen its infrastructural benefits and the opportunity for a rebuild and a restart of economy on new terms with a community that had existing strong bonds, and it wouldn't have been that hard to do the criteria. You know, you'd have to have been living there a certain amount of time. And I think that would have been enormously advantageous in places where they're still waiting, or they had been waiting for, you know, they were waiting for a year before they got any real help with accommodation and rebuilding.
Thanks, Jane. And I think that's an interesting sort of point in terms of the localization of decisions around priority for work and spending as well. Loriana, did you want to add anything with regards to the trials?
No, not much in terms of data, because as Josh and Jane has said, there are many around the world, like all with different designs, and it's all about a question: what are we looking for? And I was last year a bit of a highly critical of the Finnish trial that was run, because that the question was, well, does it help people getting back into employment? And then, you know, it goes back to the question, what are we trialing UBI for? Is it because we want to get more people in employment, or because we want, you know, to redesign society based on other form of work? So it's highly, you know, it can be easily compromised, and I'm not sure about the outcome, because again, what are we looking for?
Yeah, can I just say, in terms of redesigning society and people's motives, something that I find very interesting, or somebody I find very interesting, is Scott Santenz, who's in America. He writes articles about basic income, and he's received a unconditional livable wage through Patreon. He gets people giving him his wage. He writes about basic income. He talks about basic income. But if he were to stop doing that, I am almost 100% certain that people would still donate to him for this principle. So he's got a basic income, and what he sees as the benefit is that he doesn't have to write his articles with a profit motive in mind. He can write them and distribute them freely, and therefore get one, a larger audience, but also completely disconnect from the economic models of article publishing. And so being able to do things that don't have profit to them, but do have value to them, I think that's an important part to note in terms of a new economy, a regenerative economy.
I'd like to go back to the point you made about JobKeeper, Josh. And I'm curious about whether you think there's been a change in public attitude with regards to a livable wage in terms of the changes that we've seen over the last 18 months. And I guess this also relates to the question of, you know, what is the difference between welfare and a livable wage from your perspective?
I think the definition of a livable wage is very ambiguous. It's very difficult to nail down, and that's why there's so many different poverty lines. Henderson poverty line is good. I think $4.50 seems like a rational rate when you're thinking about rents. But I feel like that's not something that I can answer. I feel like everybody needs to chime in. I think if we set what would the rate be, and we were looking at that picture that Jane was showing earlier, of the person scavenging through the rubbish. If we said that that was considered to be living, then we could have a very low basic income, but I don't think many people would consider that to be living. Questions like, should the internet be included when we're talking about how much the rate should be paid and how much it costs to live? 10 years ago, 20 years ago, maybe we wouldn't have said that the internet is essential, but now we're seeing that the internet is essential. And so therefore the costs of living are very dynamic throughout time. And your other point was, has COVID changed the way people think about it?
Well, I guess the welfare model was quite starkly kind of outlined in the introduction of JobKeeper, and then the removal of JobKeeper, and the difference between job seeker, JobKeeper, I think was quite interesting. Could you comment on that?
I mean, I think in one respect, it's good for people to see the importance of a safety net, because I worry a lot that we live in a society that doesn't have a real safety net. The fact that we have homeless people highlights that, I think. The problem that I have is that a lot of people saw that things can change very quickly, but also a lot of people didn't see the realities of the normally operating system. They saw the newly enhanced version. So that, if anything, is the negative to come out of it. They think that it's more generous than it is. But I think the fact that things can change so quickly, all of the politicians' arguments basically fall apart when they do what they just did.
And are there any examples that you know of where a basic income has been connected with or linked with, I guess, regenerative economic activity, such as land care or other activities that may be contributing to sort of environmental movements or ecological movements?
Nothing that jumps to the front of my mind. I mean, just the fact that we were talking, oh, Loriana's got something, but I'll just say that this disconnection of like work, the thing that we've mentioned again and again throughout today's session, that would be the main, but in terms of practice, nothing jumps immediately to mind. Loriana?
Yes, I have a couple of examples in mind, which again, they are not full universal basic income trials, you know, they have conditions, but they are the closest example that we have. So there was one trial which was 2 years ago, and I think it's still ongoing because I haven't seen results yet, which is in Denmark, in Utrecht, and they had 3 categories. So they had this pool of recipients, and they divided them in 3 categories based on certain conditions. And one of the condition was they would basically receive this basic income, and in return they would give a certain amount of hours per week for like involuntary work in their community. So it's more of a trial of a participatory income more than an unconditional basic income. But then, you know, you can start and see some dynamics. Is there some behavioral change and stuff like this? And another one that was more explicitly connected to land use and regeneration is one of the conditions attached to Bolsa Familia in Brazil. So the Bolsa Familia, it's a conditional benefit payment which is given to poorer family too, and there is the condition of sending children to school in return the receipt of this benefit. And I think it was in 2018 or 19 that the government of Brazil introduced this additional measure, which is called Bolsa Verde. And this is given to poorer families in specific areas where there has been a lot of deforestation. And it's basically given to help farmers, you know, to disincentivize the clearing of rainforests. So it's like, if you stop clearing the forest, we give you this additional benefit. So it is, again, it's not a universal basic income. It's still within the broader family of conditional payments. But like in the example of the Brazilian example, it is effective. So when families and farmers that are given the Bolsa Verde, they decrease their deforestation impact.
Thank you. So I just have one more question that I'd like to put to you all, and then I'd like to open up for questions from other participants. And I have noticed that there's been quite a few questions in the chat, so we'll try to get through some of them as well. But also just noticing the wealth of knowledge and experience of people who are joining us today, and appreciate some of you sharing that in the chat as well. So I guess my last question is more around vision. And if you, if you could paint for us a bit of a picture of, say, in 20 or 30 years' time, if we were able to sort of implement a basic income, what do you think some of the differences might be sort of economically, socially and culturally in 20 or 30 years' time? So
I think I'll start.
Thanks.
Yeah. Yeah, something jumps to mind immediately for me. I mean, I talk to people a lot about just people who I'm not talking to about basic income, but people I'm just talking to generally. And I ask them what they would do if they didn't have to work and what would they spend their time doing. And one thing that really concerns me is that most people don't have the time and the energy to think about that question right now. And I think that would be the biggest shift from my perspective. People thinking about, what do I want my life to mean? What do I want it to contribute to the world? And so many people think getting paid to do something is their contribution, but it can't be. Yeah. Oh, and I'll also say I want to start a tool library. So that would be what I'd be doing in 20 years. And it would not generate a profit. No way. I would never.
Thanks, Josh. Jane, did you want to respond to that question?
I'm slightly distracted by another question that's come up on the feed that's a very, very common block question for a lot of people. Aren't you wasting it if you give it to well-off people? I think there's a number of ways of tackling that. Conventionally, you could argue, well, how many people are we talking about? Given that there's only 1% that are really, really well off, according to economists, that's not a whole lot of basic income. When you add it up, 1% is not going to amount to a large figure. But a more significant way to think, to me, is don't think of UBI in isolation. Think of it as a building block for a regenerative economy. I'm pushing this idea of the scavenger economy because nobody can opt out of it. It's our planet. That's the state it's in. That's what we have to do. My generation has kind of scooted it. We've just left the trash. But by the time you get to Greta Thunberg's generation, they know that's their heritage. Nobody opts out of that regardless of their wealth. The very fact that you might be giving somebody who's used to an income of, $200,000, $300,000, $400,000 a year, this modest sum of money by the week, gives you a nice little ethical and moral wedge. They have to actually do something. They've been given this because they're creatures of the planet. They're entitled to a subsistence from it. They are also obliged to be part of the caretaking system for it. Rights, resources, responsibilities, the 3 R's of the common good, the common treasury, as the Diggers called it, which was the original form of basic income in the European system, the commons. But you cannot receive from the earth without giving back. I think that's the moral economy at the heart. And it's a little reminder. It's actually a little reprimand to give somebody with a whole lot of noughts after their income this very modest sum and say, actually, you don't refuse this, you take it, but you must give something back for it.
Thanks, Jane. And I understand from some of the research that's been, some of the projections that have been done, that the sort of disparity of income difference may potentially be impacted by a basic income with modelling. Loriana, did you want to respond to the vision question, and then we might get down to some of the more nitty-gritty brass tacks questions that people are asking?
Yes. Well, I'm not very good at a projection question, especially I had a clearer vision before, certainly 1.5 years ago. Now I do not feel very confident in talking about it. I think, you know, I think we all have this feeling that something big has to change, and we can all perceive, you know, this like, it's kind of like energy or something like boiling underneath, but the direction, it's, I think it would be a very chaotic next 10, 20 years. So certainly for all of us already involved within universal basic income, that would give us hopefully additional strength, you know, and resources to push through this. And I would so much wish, you know, that this was the first step, and then, you know, everything else. Okay, now let's all jump on board. And this is why I'm so grateful, you know, that I met Michelle a couple of years ago, and then we have this opportunity to talk through this network, because this is the only way that I see it forward. You know, it's not one particular group, constituency of people pushing for their idea. How do we all relate to this? You know, how could a universal basic income help each and every one of us, for example, on this platform, to pursue, you know, to bring forward the change that we are all individually working on? How do we establish this network and work through this network? That's the first main step for me and for us at this stage.
Thank you. So there's a number of questions here around how would we pay for it, especially considering the negative feeling around raising taxes in this country. And Rebecca has also asked, well, actually, let's go to that first question. How would we pay for it?
Can I jump in first again?
Yes, please.
I wrote an article called How Much Does a Basic Income Cost with the Green Institute, that talks about, again, I've been running the Basic Income Australia Action Group for the last 4 years. I've talked to so many different people. There's so many different implementations, because a basic income is not a policy, it's the outcome of a policy. And so when we try and get together and talk about the policy that gets us to that outcome, there are a million different directions you can take, and that's where a lot of conflict comes in. I've lost my train of thought. What was the question again?
Could you perhaps post a link to that article about how to pay for it?
I could, yes.
That would be great.
But the thing that I like to think about is that you're talking about a resource. What is money at the end of the day? Money is a stand-in for a resource, and we can't make resources out of thin air, even if we can make money out of thin air. So I ultimately think about it in terms of a resource cost, not a dollar cost. And so at the end of the day, it has to be a wealth transfer from the wealthiest to the poorest. And that's why this question of, well, why give it to the wealthiest kind of doesn't make sense, because if I give you $100 and then take $200 from you, how much did that cost? $200 in the government budget? I don't know. I don't think that makes sense.
Thank you. Jane or Loriana, would you like to respond to that question?
Yeah. Okay. Yes, I very much agree with Josh, and it is a political question more than an economic question, but we also need to talk about money in this world. So let's talk about it. So the model that I worked on, again, as I mentioned, the Ingalls, Phillips and Stewart, is just one of many done for Australia. And I really liked that model because it was the closest approximation to a truly universal and unconditional basic income, to a level that approximates the Anderson poverty line, even if it's a bit lower. And they propose to pay for it through a 37% flat tax rate on all income and a 2% tax on wealth. And they have this big part of their article in which they define wealth. which of course is highly problematic definition, what we define by wealth. Like, for example, would the first home be considered wealth, or the first mode of transport, and all these questions that I leave aside for economists to talk about, even though I understand the importance. And that's how they got to this gross budget, and the gross cost of their universal basic income would have been $264 billion, and this was a 2019 model. And that also took into account the current spending in social housing, health, education, and additional social services. So this is one of the many models. And I could also read in the comments Gary Flamenhoft, where I highly recommend this chapter. He wrote a chapter in a Pereira book, and he has modeled one way of financing a universal basic income in Australia through what he defines the economic strength of a country. So what approximates the idea of the commons by taxing the commons, but he includes things like wave length, and not just what we think about the commons, like land and so on. Like it's a broader understanding of the commons. And I think, and Gary, I don't know if you want to comment on that, I think that you reached a gross revenue of 289 billion a year or something like that. So, which, I mean, it's so in a way, it's one way of try and argue that the money are there if we want to spend it in this way. That's my short, long answer.
Thank you. Gary, did you want to respond to that?
She remembers the number better than I do, but it came out to about $12,000 per person per year. Okay.
And I would like to recommend people to also have a look at the NENA website. The Universal Basic Income Hub have put together some fantastic resources and lists of resources there, which you can access. And we'll post the link to that shortly in the chat. Now there's a number of other questions. I was wondering if anyone has any burning questions that they'd like to ask, rather than me deciding which ones to put to the panel.
So I'd like it if the panel could respond to the issue of why we don't increase or have welfare payments that are basically unconditional.
Thanks, Michelle. Would anyone like to respond to that?
I'm confused by the question. So the question is why we don't make job seeker apply that to everybody?
No, just apply it to the people who need it.
Oh, so why not just do that?
Yeah.
So, yeah. So what you're talking about would be called a guaranteed basic income. That's what GetUp has named it. And it's this issue of if you make it conditional, then you allow cracks in the system that people can fall through. And so by making it unconditional, you ensure that nobody gets left behind. And second, there's a psychological benefit of knowing that you, just as a citizen, you're part of society, and that that inclusion is important, I think.
Thank you, Josh.
Thank you.
I believe Jason has been waiting very patiently to ask a question. Jason.
Thank you.
Yeah, sorry, I'll just add this later.
I'll put my hand down. Oh, is it down already? No, lower hand. Okay, thanks very much. Yes, I have a concern with basic income as a choice instead of basic assets. And my concern is that if income is handed over by those who don't have assets to those that do have assets, then in a marketplace economy that we have at the moment, that income will go to those who already have assets that can then own more assets, that can raise the price of rent, for example, with a house. And we have a cycle that actually could get worse unless rent was controlled or other price controls exist. Alternatively, if the program was to increase asset ownership by those who don't have assets, then if it's a process, it means gradually a person's cost of housing, for example, would go down, and it would be a systemic solution.
Can I have a quick response?
Yes,
I
please.
think that's an absolutely essential point, because in our current economy, it would only take one step for the landowning sector to mop up the lot by increasing rents. So it really does have to be looked at in the context of an overall change to the economy. I think it's very hard to think of a viable way of introducing basic income without ancillary fundamental changes to the economy. I mean, one response to your concern is a land tax, and the Progress Group in Melbourne have been campaigning on that consistently for decades, and they continue to model that. And that's quite an intelligent way to offset the costs of basic income to the current economic model as well, because if you look at the commons as the kind of underlying model for it, that's not a monetary allocation. That is an allocation of resources. And as Josh says, money is resources at one remove. And if you own land, you own more than your share of the common resources. So there's a certain kind of moral logic as well as an economical logic about a land tax in association with this.
Thanks, Jane.
Can I jump in? I want to say, first of all, I agree, Jason, that's a good idea. I like it. So definitely not in opposition here. But I would ask a response question to you, which is, are you in favor of a minimum wage? And would you be in favor of raising the minimum wage, just in terms of employment? So somebody working at McDonald's, them getting more money.
I think that's a great question, and highlights the choice that occurred 100 years ago when unions chose to remain in relationship to an employer and improve those relationships. And it chose that instead of the worker cooperative model, to shift the ownership of production to those who are employed. Now, if there was a hybrid of those, then I would have been satisfied. But to the degree that unionization of employment moved away from moving towards a co-ownership, then I think there was a choice that was made, a fork in the road that set 100 years of politics and values and mindset. And I think we have to reconsider the choice to remain in an employee-employer relationship instead of asking, can we change that relationship to co-ownership with employment and the conditions of employment?
Thanks, Jason. There's some very big questions there for us to consider. And I'm aware of time, and we really value your time to join us today. And I'd like to thank all of our speakers, Josh, Jane, and Loriana, so much for your time, and for all of you for joining us for this conversation. I do feel like this is just the tip of the iceberg in terms of this conversation, and I hope very much to be able to continue this. I'd like to now just invite Rhiannon to share with us a little bit about some things that are coming up in NENA, where we may have an opportunity to continue some of these conversations. Although I can see, Josh, would any of our speakers like to make one final point before we go to the wrap up?
Yeah, can I just quickly mention, so we're talking about unions. The Basic Income Australia group, we have monthly action meetings. We also have monthly discussion meetings. Next Wednesday, we've got a unions and basic income event. So perhaps you'll be interested in coming along. We're talking to Godfrey Mose. So that should be interesting and exciting. You can find links and information at basicincomeaustralia.com.
Thank you. And thank you for reminding me, Josh. I did mean to ask you know, what might be the best way for people to remain engaged with this conversation. So obviously we've got Basic Income Australia. We have the NENA UBI hub. Are there any other ways that anyone would like to suggest?
Yes, there is an international activist hub as well. They do meet weekly. The problem that we all here in Australia found with that group is that it's at very inconvenient times for us on the other side of the world. So I will link in, I'll write the name of the group. You'll find YouTube videos because you can just look at the recordings. And so this is a network, this is an international network of activists and advocates around the world on universal basic income with updates from everywhere. So a lot of information, very interesting discussions.
Thank you very much, Loriana. Jane or Loriana, did you want to add any final words?
Only just to acknowledge that a great deal has been happening on that chat line. And one of the great advantages of Zoom is that although a lot of that wasn't actually heard, it's on the record, and very valuable to have that. I know as part of the hub for this, we'll be very keen to go through all that. So thank you everyone for doing that.
Thank you, and I will save that chat as well. So over to you, Rhiannon, to wrap up today.
Great, thank you, Monique, and thank you to all the speakers and participants. It's been such a fascinating, robust discussion today, and like Monique said, hopefully this will continue, and it will continue through the UBI hub in NENA, through our events and hopefully the 2021 conference as well. So just in terms of NENA, to stress again, so we are a cooperative and we've worked really hard to create a distributed governance network. And the way that is enforced is through the autonomous hubs or semi-autonomous hubs that we have, so such as the UBI hub. And you can join any of these hubs if you become a NENA member. So we do encourage people to work in solidarity and become a member, join our hub, get involved in these discussions and help organise events and that sort of thing. I would like to flag a couple of events that are coming up that people might be interested in. So for those of you that are potentially researchers, we have a research jam coming up in June, and you can find that information on our NENA website, which I'll put into the chat. So we're calling for proposals up until the end of the month. So we still have 11 days. And we also have proposals for the NENA 2021 conference. So if anyone is interested in speaking at the conference, we are calling for proposals, and I'll just put the website in the chat there. You can find all of that on the homepage. So there's plenty of opportunities to get involved with NENA, and yeah, we would love to have you all on board. So yeah, I just want to say thank you again to everyone. It's been a great event today. We have recorded it, so if you missed the beginning, we'll be sending that one out to attendees and putting it up on the website. So yeah, if everyone wanted to give a big round of applause, and thank you, Monique.
Yeah, let's unmute and give ourselves a round of applause for turning up today. Yay!
Yay, thank you.
Go team. All right, thanks everybody. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks for your time.
Bye.
Bye.